In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we are fast approaching the end of the chapter titled The Planes of Our Existence. Here, Sri Aurobindo has defined what makes for a world or a plane of consciousness based on the relationship between the Purusha and Prakriti, nature, the observing soul consciousness and the energy of expression. There are many relationships possible between these two, and each of these relationships, when fully developed and expressed, is a world in itself. First of all, he says, beyond the life world is a mental plane, a world of mental existence in which neither life nor matter, but mind is the first determinant. Mind there is not determined by material conditions or by the life force, but itself determines and uses them for its own satisfaction. So we have to now conceive of a domain where matter does not exist, life energy does not exist, and there is only mental awareness. What for your pure mind is forward and what for your pure mind is behind? Think about this for a moment. If you're purely aware as a mental awareness, no sense of directions, nothing of the physical world exists. And then you say in your mind, I want to move ahead. What's the sense of ahead? And here the sense is purely one of the future. It's the sense of movement forward in time. And the sense of behind is the sense of what you have left back in the past. Contrast this with the vital energy. When it thinks or when it feels the flow forward, it is more an action being done towards a certain outcome. It's not in a sense of time, but in terms of a sense of action, of change, of production. And what you leave behind is the thing which has to do with either what pulls you back energetically, what delays, or what is heavy, or what now breaks down. A similar thing happens in mind, but the quality is totally different. It is of the conceptual awareness now thinking ahead, and it's a movement as if forward in time to create, to form, but not energetically in idea. So when in your consciousness you look at the future and say, I am going to do this, and you begin to think about it and organize it, this is largely a mental exercise. When into this you add your vital force, I must do it, I have to direct my energies, you gather your full force for an outcome. That is aligning the vital to the mental idea. And then when you translate that finally into physical action, you start taking steps and movements and actions, then you're aligning the physical. But there are three very distinct operations on three very distinct levels. When all three are aligned, then you have the successful outcome. If you eliminate even one of these, you will not have the outcome. If you eliminate, for example, the physical action, you can put an idea, you can put a strong energy for it, but nothing happens until you move. Of course, the idea and energy you put out might catch somebody else and work through them, but still it needs a physical action to finally end up in a physical result. Otherwise, you've only created a formation which either depends on instruments or eventually fizzles out of its own. Similarly, if you remove the vital and you have a clear mental idea, but now you try to actualize it, but without the dynamism and the push and the enthusiasm of energy, you can do the work very quietly, perhaps even succeed in completing it, but it will be a very simple, bare, minimal outcome. When there is a strong vital energy pouring, it will tend to aggrandize, dramatize, make large, spread it out, which is typically the characteristic of the vital. In most of the utopian ideas that we have, let's make this perfect, let's make it ideal, without the vital element aligned to it, you will make small little patches of that perfection, and they hardly last, or they hardly have a strong impact on the environment around them. So the vital engagement with the clarity of the mind, and ideally with this spiritual energy, would make for the dramatic outcome which impacts in a larger space. Similarly, without that mental domain, you can have a strong vital push and a very strong physical activity, but the outcome may often be chaotic, or it may be haphazard because not guided by the clarity of the mind. Now, all three in us need to be developed separately to begin with, and then integrated and aligned so that they can work together as one. There are many people in whom there is a great sattvic quality in thought. They can often act with great precision, but they lack a strong vital, which is often the character of the the sattvic person. He does not have too much of the problem of strong desires, rajasic pulls and pushes. On the other hand, the outcome is also not very strong and effective. Equally, there are people who have strong vitals, very rajasic, often trapped by their own desire impulses, and for them it's difficult to hold the purity of the conception without mixing elements of their own push. So, we are speaking of the mind in itself. And we are not normally conscious of the mind, but when we try this experiment of the mind turned like this, to become separately conscious from the vital and the physical, it's a new experience. Because we have never trained the mind in itself in separation. We have not even learned to identify it as a separate experience, or the vital, or even the pure physical consciousness, and to feel what the body experiences separate from the vital and mind. All the trainings of the past were done with a focus on one of these, but never with a direct experience of these separately. And this is something which is to be worked upon, and it's an interesting exercise. And each of these separately can then be connected and aligned to the soul's experience. So, the mind, that is to say, the psychical and the intellectual being, is free in a certain sense. Free at least to satisfy and fulfill itself in a way hardly conceivable to our body-bound and life-bound mentality. Free in a certain sense, we touched upon this last time, because you're still bound to the type of your mind, to the manner of your thinking, which is often bound to the culture in which you grew up, or even a country-specific patterns of thought, or language-specific patterns of thought, and then elements of upbringing where you're taught to think in terms of self-interest, collective interest, or religious interest, or some other social values. And all of these form, let's say, the cage of the mind. And the beauty of the mental cage is that you think you're free because you're not conscious of the cage itself. The skill of the mind in its highest development, left to itself, is the power of convincing itself of anything, and therefore the power of deceiving itself. That's how Mother describes it. The epitome of the power of the intellect is to so convince itself to believe what it wants that it cannot see anything beyond that. And so it is a form of self-deception. But this essential tendency of mind, inability to see its own failures or its own limitations, is what makes for this golden cage of the mind. In practice, in society and in human history, we find that the easiest way to trap somebody, to enslave somebody, either an individual, a group, or even an entire civilization, is to own their mind. This is the reason why you will see in any form of colonization, the first thing that they will attack is the educational system, where they will remove elements which come from within your own tradition and bring in something alien and shape the minds of the new generations. We see so he says here, mind, that is to say the psychical and intellectual being, is free in a certain sense. And this is its freedom. You have a sense of freedom. I can choose to do what I want. But it's a golden cage. Free at least to satisfy and fulfill itself in a way hardly conceivable to our body-bound and life-bound mentality. So the body-bound and life-bound mentality is this part which is thinking at the moment, for example, when you wake up from sleep. You wake up and your mind is a bit dull, and all of its thoughts largely are oriented to your body's comforts or fulfilling your desire impulses. You wake up in the middle of the night, you think you're thinking clearly, and there's a particular problem in your life which you brood upon. You take decisions. Tomorrow I will speak to that fellow, I will write a note, I will react. But when you wake up in the morning and you review what you were thinking in that half-awake state, you realize how ridiculous it is, and it does not fit your more woken up state of mind. But at that point you could not distinguish that you are actually in a vital mind state, not the pure power of the intellect that can stand back from itself and even recognize its own limitations. And so this is the problem of the vital mind, body-bound and life-bound mentality. And you will see in many animals, the body-bound, life-bound mentality can be very developed, almost like a human being, as you can see with dogs, extremely intelligent, but it stops there. You can teach the dog 1,000 times not to chase after the car, but the impulse to chase will always be there, and the mind will be led by that impulse. The pure intellect stands back from these and is capable of, he says, the psychical and intellectual being is free in a sense, free at least to satisfy and fulfill itself in a way hardly conceivable. And this power of the mind that can actually stand back and imagine anything and dedicate itself to trying to make it possible. It's a tremendous power, but it needs to be fully trained. Our current education, similarly, is not really taking this to its full potential. Increasingly, we find the educational system being dumbed down to leave us halfway in the vital mind, not bringing us to that full power of the rational thought which can stand back from the vital and the physical and even dominate them. But this is something which is extremely necessary for the future of a civilization, for it to reach its highest possibilities. But before we proceed, he has spoken of mind as first determinant, neither life nor matter as first determinant, but suggesting that they are present there as second or third determinants. And this is something interesting to observe. Sri Aurobindo explains, and perhaps we will have time today to read that text. He explains how within each plane the principles of the other planes are present. And so in the pure mind awareness, there is something of the vital element of the force and drive of energy which is brought into the mind. So for example, you conceive of an idea, I am going to organize this, and then into that idea you bring a certain intensity and force of idea. And that's as if something of the vital character or the principle of the vital operating in mind, but it's not really the vital. It is force in mind, the principle working in mind. Similarly, in your mind you can create images and forms. Not only as visual pictures, which is obvious, you can picture a flower, for example, picture a red rose, easy to do. And actually in the mental world you have gathered mental substance which forms a mental image. It can be, if your mind is clear enough, it can be clear enough that somebody else in the mental plane can see it objectively. There's an interesting incident which I had heard. This is a spiritual teacher, master in Europe, who was meeting a young girl for the first time, and she narrated this. She said, when I went to him, he said, "Can you imagine the most beautiful form of an angel? Your favorite form of an angel?" And he asks her to picture it. And as she pictures, he says, "Oh, the wings are very beautiful." And he begins to describe what she has pictured. Now this is possible if you're aware in the mental body and are able to independently perceive things of the mental world through the mental body. And you will see somebody else's thought forms. And this sense of form is coming to the principle of the physical world. The physical world is world of form. Mind world idea is not really primarily form, as vital is not primarily form. But yet the principle of form in the mental world allows for the creation of a form, but into it the principle of form can also bring substantiality, a kind of a density of substance. And all of this can be added or built in the thought form. But separate from this, which is really a replication of a physical rose to which you have given a picture and form in mind, separate from this, a pure idea has a form. And this is something more interesting to observe. So for example, let's say you have an idea of, if I put the word, the idea of beauty. Now, as the word beauty does not bind itself to anything, nor to any force. It is a purely intellectual idea. If I give you the idea of freedom, and again it's a pure abstract intellectual idea, it has not bound to any form. You could express it through many forms, but it itself is a pure essential idea available only in the mental domain. Or I will give the idea of narrowness. And if you hold the pure idea of narrowness without any specific form which expresses it, the quality of these three, beauty, freedom, narrowness, totally different. Can you feel the qualitative difference of these things? The sense of beauty has, and we don't have words to describe, but a kind of a glow or a sparkle to it. The sense of freedom has a quality of wideness or lightness to it. The sense of the word narrow or narrowness, of course, has to be narrow, but also kind of a sense of movement of compression in the idea. Now this exercise of just dwelling upon the pure idea without limiting it to form is your first experience of what it's like to experience things of the mental world in a purely mental consciousness. And this is not normally done. We are not trained to it. At best, our mind is always turned to vital or physical forms and only exercising their representations in the mental world. As I said, picture a rose or picture a building or picture a sunrise. Yes, you can create those pictures. But they are mental representations of physical realities. They are not things that belong purely to mental domain. But one example of things that belong to purely to mental domain is pure numbers and relationships of numbers. I touched upon this last time. If you think of relationships of numbers, you have this pure abstraction, no form associated, but feelings of connections like a mesh of networks connecting different numbers. Now imagine you enter into this world of a pure mental idea and begin to experience things like this. What would it feel like? And you experience things now, pure idea forms, and you now rearrange them. I feel the idea form relating to a certain situation, and into that I bring another idea form and infuse into it. Let's take a situation that's happening in the world involving certain group of human beings where you see a certain conflict or chaos. Of course it is energetic, of course it has physical causes. But in the idea, mind of those people, there is also a strife. If you become conscious of the idea form of that strife feeling, and then you become conscious of this beauty, harmony idea, and gently bring that to settle into it, and shift the state of that idea form, the result will be an effect on the idea state of those people, which when they wake up, let's say this is being done in the night, they wake up and in the morning suddenly everything is more clear and they are better harmonized among themselves and things happen more easily. Now such an intervention is of course possible only to somebody who's conscious on those levels and has the ability to exercise that influence on certain groups and perhaps even large groups, and if they have access to something still higher, which would be something of the spiritual action. So I'm going to read out something from the mother where she describes an action that she was doing which is similar to this. Of course, it was not a pure idea action. It was from a still higher state of consciousness, so it has a spiritual content to it, but still you will see how it works. This is from the mother speaking to Satprem in the agenda, and she's speaking of work that she did the night before in this way, and while she was doing this work, in the middle of the work she said, yes, I have to show this to Satprem. This is February 5th, 1969. And she says, I remember a vision of the night in which I did a work with numbers and put the numbers, figures and groups of figures in a certain position. That's what I wanted to tell you. In the dream, if we may call it a dream, I said to myself that I should show it to you. Now I remember, it comes like this, gesture from behind mother's head. And then it's associated with groups of people who are everywhere, spread all over the earth. And in relation with which planet? I don't know planets. Very interesting. And she mentions this in passing, but the suggestion is groups of people in relation with some other planets perhaps. And she doesn't elaborate. And I remember saying to myself, all that during the night, not after waking up, while preparing that whole arrangement, I still see the arrangement of figures I was preparing. They were quite living. The figures were living things, groups of figures I was arranging. With one arrangement like this, one arrangement like that, Mother seems to move about the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. And in fact, you were there, she tells Satprem. And I told you that when it was like this, Mother draws one particular arrangement, it expressed such and such a thing, while when it was like that, another arrangement of the puzzle, it expressed such and such other thing. And at the same time I said, not only does it express this thing, but it has a power for realizing it. All that is there. Mother gestures behind her head as if to show a memory in the background, somewhere there. And it was connected with groups of people who were in different places of the earth. And it was, it was the ciphered expression of the application to life in a coming realization. The expression of the life ahead, but not very far ahead. For instance, in the following century, the century starting now. So 1969, she is speaking of 2000 onwards. Not very far ahead. You see, her vision far ahead would be 200 or 300 years or 1000 years. But she was doing something in this arrangement of things for an outcome which should begin from that point 30 years later. But that's probably what remained in the memory which made me want to tell you something. But I can see the arrangement of figures. I spent a long time arranging. A truer, more universal application, and with the spiritual knowledge, the principle of the position and utilization of individuals on earth. And I don't know why it particularly interested you. You were with me with this arrangement of figures, and I showed you 2 columns here and 1 column there. but living columns, not on paper, in the air. I don't know how to explain that. It was in the air, and I arranged, moved the figures about like that, and those figures were living. They weren't written on a paper. There were different groups of figures. There were two groups. Some were dark blue and others golden yellow. And how can I explain? They weren't male and female. They were two principles not of creation but conception, a gesture of coming down from above, and the principle of realization. When I do that, she says, I'm wholly conscious. It's not a dream. I don't sleep in the ordinary way. I am as if asleep, but I don't sleep and I don't dream. I act. I'm wholly conscious with the same kind of consciousness as the waking consciousness. It's not a dream. I was doing that and explaining to you how all those figures were organizing themselves and determining future events. And then she explains how when she comes back to her body state of awareness, waking up as we would call it, all that memory recedes because she says, I cannot hold all that here, otherwise it would interfere with my work. Only what is needed for the immediate work is brought forward in her day-to-day interactions with people, and all the rest is in her larger consciousness held behind so that it does not interfere. There's a whole longer description. I would perhaps leave it to you to read if it interests you. And she says it went on for about 2.5 hours. It was like a giant control room where she gives the example of pulling levers in a control room of a factory, and it has the chain reaction of events happening everywhere. And she says it was the organization of those groups of figures that determined the events and the order of events, especially the order of events and their location on earth. Again, I skip a lot. And she says, what's being prepared to manifest on earth? I don't know if we should call it subtle physical. It's the creative zone of the physical. It's there. And I can't run from one place to another. What I do is linked through figures like that, living figures. I organize them, group them together, and I remember what I did the previous day with the knowledge that it has to be changed again tomorrow. And that's what determines events. But the consciousness, the waking or ordinary consciousness, must not know what's decided there. It must know only a part necessary to the execution. She speaks of the goldenish and bluish, but again she says it's not physical colors. One group like this, one group of that. I kept arranging them, and then the figures were very big. And I'll leave it at that. So this arrangement is an example of what happens in the pure consciousness of the mental world, where everything is known by its essential mental idea. And in this sense you get an idea of the sense of essentiality. What is this flower? Well, it's a particular representation of that particular flower species. It has its mental form, which is specific to this, but the mental form idea of this flower is not just what the form you see here in the physical world, but the full idea of flower. Now you can imagine idea of this flower when you hold in your head. You can take out this flower, or you can see this flower after 1 day, after 2 days when it begins to fade, but the idea of this flower is still the same, isn't it? That's how you'll hold pure idea. But separate from the pure idea of this flower is pure idea of this flower, which is different. Not very different. Even physically, if you looked at both, you would find it difficult to recognize the difference. But if I said idea of this flower is very different from idea of this flower. But then there is species of flower and idea of this species, species of this flower and idea of species, and then one can look at something even more essential. idea of flower only, of which this is a particularization and that is a particularization. And now you hold just in your mind idea of just flower as a thing in itself, and already you don't have a form. Mother explains how in the mental world there are many levels. There is the level where it is turned to the physical, turned to the vital, and then mind aware in itself, and then within that there are finer gradations higher up. And she uses this in a different context. She says you can train yourself, for example, to think in words, is what we do. And unfortunately, much of our early education, we are taught to think in words. So you read a textbook and you are asked to enunciate the words, which is a very damaging thing. While it may help you to develop the speech, but afterwards it prevents your mind from being free of the physical word form. But if you can free yourself and think without words, you'll find your thought process speeds up enormously. But you may still have word forms associated. Then she says, you can rise above that one more level and think not with words, but with pure ideas. A single idea can express itself in many different words. A very simple exercise to do this is to translate from one language to another. So take a text in any language that you're familiar with and do this as an exercise. Translate it sentence by sentence into another language which you are familiar with. So some texts you will find very easy to translate. I am going home, easy to translate. You will have different words, different arrangement of terms, but I going home and perhaps something equivalent to am will be merged into some word depending on the language. Very simple to translate. But if you try to translate a term, which is highly nuanced in a particular culture, even if you use the word spiritual, for example, in the English language, it's highly nuanced depending on context. And when you try to translate that, you will struggle. Just a word. But if you have a complex sentence, you will struggle to translate because the sentence has nuances or it may have multiple meanings which you can't translate easily. Or you do not have an equivalent word which is purely meaning exactly the same thing in a different language. But all of this you'll become aware at the moment when you try to translate, your mind rises above from the word form of thought to pure idea, and now it tries to articulate itself in a different word form of the language, and it doesn't fit. How do you do that? You hold the pure idea and then you try to translate. It doesn't fit. Mother has a very interesting conversation about this when she was translating Savitri. And she says there are two ways to do it. One is you don't care about the idea, you just go word for word. And you know this word, you take the equivalent of it and you just translate. That's how Google Translate would do it for you. And then she says, you rise above the words, not just to the idea, but above idea to conception and to experience. You experience the thing itself. And then you pour the experience into the new form of the language. And then it takes a different rhythm. And she says they give different forms when you translate. But she says it will be interesting to see if it ends up eventually with the same thing or not. And it's not always obviously the same thing. Even sometimes the nuances of language can be so different for a person, from person to person. So in one part of the country, people use this word in a particular way and nuance. In another part, it is used in a different way. And when they speak, they may use the same word but understand it in a completely different way. And it can lead to misunderstandings easily. But the exercise of going like this will force your mind to rise to that level of pure idea. Do it as a training. And then above that is pure conception, Mother says, where a simple concept can articulate itself in many ideas, and each idea into many forms of words. And you can rise to a level of pure conceptual thought process. And you look at a situation, you abstract to its concepts, and you work on the concepts. And then you turn it into specific ideas. A skillful person who had that ability but applied to a physical outcome was this person called Steve Jobs, who is famous now for inventing the Apple computer and Apple mobile phone, which really redefined the whole field. But he had this ability to rise to a more essential concept and then from there reform and move. And most people that we call geniuses or scientists who have to operate on a very high level of abstraction have this ability, especially the mathematicians, because pure mathematics is domain of mind. And it's a very good training for this higher level of abstraction. But then Mother says above that even there is the pure experience. And that's the part where the mind turns towards intuitive consciousness. And there you experience the thing, and a single experience can articulate itself through many different concepts, each of which can articulate through many different ideas, each of which can articulate through many different words. And of course combinations of words, ideas or concepts. For example, the experience, and especially to do with spiritual experiences, but even a complex human experience. The first time that you have a strong, unusual experience, you do not know how to express it in words. And there are many components, many elements to it. And you try to catch this or that, or you sequence them in a certain way of priority. But in the experience, they are not necessarily sequenced. But the moment you have to turn it into spoken speech or written word, you have to sequence it. And so the experience itself gets as if folded up. You sat before the ocean and suddenly you had the experience of being one with the whole ocean. Or you were lying down on the terrace and suddenly you felt one with the whole universe. And now you try to articulate that. For example, you'll say, oh, there was a sense of vastness. It was as if everything was myself, or as if I was everywhere in everything. And you see, you're sequencing it. But in the experience, it was one thing. That's it. Now you're fragmenting it. The sense of vastness, the sense of identification, the sense of I was everything. No, everything was me. No. Which one? Neither. Both of these are artificial forms specific to mind. In experience, it was one. In mind, I was that or that was I. The two aspects of the same, but already fragmented and often placed as if in opposition to each other. Which was stronger, the sense of vastness or the sense of identity? Neither. They were one experience, but now you've already fragmented them. And then you will translate it further into certain ideas. And you can see how very quickly it breaks up and is lost. Now if I read that text purely as words, I may get nothing of it. Oh yeah, it sounds interesting, weird. Or if while reading the words I try to tune into what the person experienced, I might catch a glimpse of the experience. And so the words help to turn my attention directly. What if I could enter in direct relation with that experience and have it without the words? Then I would know exactly what the person experienced. But using words as an entry point, I may have a glimpse and it may stop because, oh, was it this? Was it that? Did you mean this? But I have already translated it because you said, I felt as if I was everywhere. So now I try to project myself and feel what would that feel like. Or the person says, I felt as if the universe was within me. They are just two different aspects of that experience. But now I have to swing into one of these. It's in this way that you have religions conflicting or philosophies conflicting. In the approach to the Absolute, you can say the Absolute is not this, not this, not this, not this, unendingly. Or you can approach the Absolute and say this also and this also and this also, and include everything unendingly. Both chains will lead you to the Absolute, but they are as if opposite to each other in the mind domain. So what happens is, in the mind itself there are strata. You can learn to think and experience on those levels, and on each of those levels, you can begin to relate to and perceive and exchange knowledge even from others. But if you can rise to this level of experience, that's when you have the highest station available for the mind. And of course, within that, you could rise to still more complete experiences. I'll give an example of how this can happen or the value of this training. When Mother was in the 60s working on the cellular consciousness, she found a certain mantra to be very effective for the cells and giving them a means to formulate their aspiration by the repetition of Om Namo Bhagavate. At that point, Kapali Shastriyar, who was master of Sanskrit, who had translated, who had formulated in pure Sanskrit Sri Aurobindo's approach to the Vedic interpretation, which Sri Aurobindo himself had corrected, and so translated the Rig Veda with that approach, corrected by Sri Aurobindo. He had left his body in 1954. So 1960s, Mother is doing this work with the mantra, and she said Kapali Shastriyar approached her and said, I find that you are interested in this knowledge of the mantras and of Sanskrit. I would be happy to give you my knowledge. And then Mother says, I opened my mind and he poured all his knowledge into me. That's it. So now she has all the knowledge that he had in a very physical, material way, and it's all just received. And she could articulate whatever she needed to at that point. This ability to literally transmit, pour out, or give knowledge, the pour is a way of describing. It's literally mind joining and then receiving the imprint of knowledge. The analogy you would say a flame lighting another candle, the flame is not diminished, but it still has a difference. Here it's mind uniting and it just receives, and that's it. This kind of a direct transmission through an experiential identification and the knowledge need not mean, depending on the level and the degree to which it was done, need not mean that she would be able to speak like him. It's rather the ability and the familiarity of the language and the knowledge which then she will express in her style, according to her need and her form of mind. But the knowledge at its most essential experiential level is the same. So it's something very interesting here. If we can train ourselves to become conscious on this level, you can actually open and receive like that any knowledge, including directly from the source, all knowledge. But of course, to receive all knowledge, your container must become wide enough to embrace it all. So, but still, initially, in bits, you can receive whatever is required. All of this is available to this domain of mind. Someone asks, the question is there any difference between the spiritual and the psychic? Are they two different planes? And Mother gives a long explanation how the word spiritual has been so misused because anything non-physical is spiritual. And so she says, compared to the physical world, all other worlds are called spiritual. And she is, of course, referring to certain vocabularies, and particularly in French, where spirituel is anything to do with a non-material. And it's a common term you will find people say, oh, not of the physical world, it is spiritual, and that's it. And then she speaks about how if you catch words, then you will enter into confusion because someone uses the word spiritual, you use the word spiritual, but you mean something totally different. And then she explains, and she uses this occasion now to go deeper into the whole question. So long as you have to draw your understanding from forms of words, you are likely to fall into much confusion about the true sense. But if in a silence of your mind you can rise into the world from which ideas descend to take form, at once the real understanding comes. So Pure idea descending to take form and then taking form of words. She continues, but here, in this higher region of the unexpressed mind, in its purer altitudes, you are free. When you enter there, you go out of yourself and penetrate into a universal mental plane in which each individual mental world is dipping as if into a huge sea. So, this is very interesting description. We will picture it like this. In our minds, in each one of us, above the brain thinking is the purer mind thinking. And then into that, there's a higher part of your mind, which is above words. And there's the pure essential thought. And each one of us has this domain of pure essential thought. We may not live there, we may not be conscious of it, but it is there even when you live in this more physical brain word part of the mind. But that is there. But each one of us has its own quality, climate, world of thoughts, pure essential thoughts. So when you rise into your pure essential thoughts, and I rise into my pure essential thoughts, and each one of us, each plugs in into this domain of pure essential mind awareness, in which you can see each of these plugging in. There is if little patches of that universal pure mind awareness. Okay. So now with this picture, you will see penetrate into a universal mental plane in which each individual mental world is dipping as if into a huge sea. So that's your local space of the sea. There you can understand entirely what is going on in another and read his mind as if it were your own. Because there is because there no separation divides mind from mind. Now, the moment you enter that domain in your part of mind, and from there you meet someone else's mind, well, it is part of one continuum of the sea of mind. So, what happens in another mind is happening in your sea. And so, you know exactly what it is in a spontaneous identification. Nothing dividing, nothing separating. You drop down from that level and the divisions start. It becomes more and more fixed in idea form. The moment you have form, which binds, you have separation, and then it comes down to word form and language form, and then culture form, and then someone says spiritual, and you say spiritual, and you mean something totally different. He goes to the library, you go into some kind of meditation, but they're different worlds. It is only when you unite in that region with others that you can understand them. Otherwise, you are not attuned, you do not touch. And this is what Mother has read from her Questions and Answers of 1929. And now she comments on it. It is only in the silence that one can understand. It often happens that two persons speak about a certain subject, and all of a sudden, for some reason, both fall silent for a time. Then abruptly, one says a word which corresponds exactly to what the other was thinking. These are people who understand each other in silence. They have followed the same curve, they have come to the same result, and one completes the thought of the other. This happens often to those who have lived together a long time and have developed a sort of mental affinity which enables them to truly understand each other behind the words. So you'll see sometimes with people, couples who have been together very long in harmony, one of them looks at the other and instantly you know the other has caught the thought, you know what it is that's intended, and that's it. I have known people who belong to different countries, Mother says. And you know, the mode of thinking is very different according to the country. The manner of relating the sequence of ideas is different, even contrary to that of another country. But I have had experiences with persons of very far removed races who succeeded so well in harmonizing mentally with each other that there was this understanding without words. So, obviously, for this understanding, you need to rise to the zone where you have, she says, silence. That is, the words stop and there is pure thought, pure idea. But what she's speaking here is very interesting, and it takes us into another side discussion, which is worth entering into. She says that different sequence of ideas, even according to different countries, Not only in the form of thought values, you have priorities which are different. In certain cultures, the thinking is inside out. In other cultures, it is outside in. And literally, they go opposite directions in their experience of life or in their thought and articulation. Words. Now, all of this makes for the thinking pattern of the mind to be so different according to which language you have grown up with and the cultural context which has given to that language certain values. And this makes mind type, mind form, mind structure, and habit to be totally different. When, therefore, you have people meeting across such boundaries with completely different way of looking inside out and outside in, it's so difficult to work together. And this is part of the challenge of Auroville, to bring together all the cultures and their different values and find this harmony at a deeper level which transcends these differences of form and approaches. And so it will be very useful if everybody starts learning other languages or sharing each other's cultures, which is also one of the objectives in the very structure of Auroville's design, to have the pavilions representing what each culture and language and tradition brings, and so on. But to be fully worthwhile and successful in this objective, we have to make effort to reach out across these boundaries and get to know each other. So Mother is speaking of this. I come back now to the text, that she knew people who had a mode of thinking very different according to the country. The manner of relating the sequence of ideas is different, even contrary to that of another country. And we skip that. She speaks of the mood of different countries as a vibration of consciousness, which you can feel and distinctly recognize, and we skip that. But we now come to something very important. She speaks of how we have literally, you sense the vibration of a vital space or a mental space. And this was her experience when she was approaching Pondicherry. She felt Aurobindo's atmosphere and recognized it. If indeed you are accustomed to this perception of the subtle physical, you can say immediately, this is as in France. This air is as in France, or this is the air of Japan. It is something indefinable like taste or smell. But in this instance, it is not that. It is a perception of another sense. It is a physical sense. It is not a vital or mental sense. It is a sense of the physical world, but there are other senses than the 5 that we usually have at our disposal. There are many others. Actually, for the physical being, note that I say the physical being, to be fully developed, it must have 12 senses. Amazing observation. It is one of those senses which gives you the kind of perception I was speaking of. 12 senses. Recently, there has been a similar thought, similar exploration, even in the scientific field, that we actually have other senses. For example, we have a sense of the magnetic field of the earth and other senses. But she has not elaborated, she has just said this. You cannot say that it is taste, smell, hearing, etc., but it is something which gives you a very precise impression of the difference of quality. It is very precise, as distinct as seeing black and white. It is truly a sense perception. Now she comes into this domain of developing this direct perception of things. And this is our focus and what she follows next. Generally, when you want to study occultism, the first thing that the master does is never to speak to you about it, never to explain it to you, precisely because of this ridiculous phenomenon of the mind which begins to think about it and brings you experiences which have no value. They're mental formations which make a plaything of you, that is all. They have no reality. You must distrust the mind altogether when you want to enter the world of experiences. It is enough for the mind to be just slightly roused for it to say, what's going on? Then it may be that things do happen, but it is no longer the thing, it is a fabrication. So, your mind, you can tell yourself, what would it be like if you were conscious in your dream, immediately your mind is going to create a construction. And the problem after that is when we ask you to experience an out of body experience, you will try to replicate what your mind's conception of it was. In fact, when you have an out of body experience and you're conscious as a lucid dream, the quality of consciousness and experience is so different that it doesn't correspond to this at all. So you can come back from the experience and say, was that an out of body experience or was it some dream or imagination? Because it didn't correspond to your preconceived notion. So the thing to do, and this is what she says in the occultism or any even a spiritual transmission of experience, you experience the thing, get used to it, and then now you start understanding what it is and give to it a vocabulary and a label. So, but for the first thing required, she says, first condition, know how to keep silent. And not only keep your tongue quiet, but silence your mind. Keep the head silent. If you wish to have a true, sincere experience upon which you can build, you must know how to be silent. Otherwise, you have nothing but what you fabricate yourself, which is equivalent to zero. All that one can say is, heavens, what a fashioner my mind is. Now, this is one passage, and there is subsequent to this another passage where she elaborates on this, and we want to get into this now. However, that may be, I believe it is a practice to be recommended to everyone to keep a certain time every day to make the mind quiet, even still. And it is an undeniable fact that the more mentally developed one is, the quicker one succeeds. And the more the mind is in a rudimentary state, the more difficult it is. Now, this is in a context where she says how in certain Buddhist traditions, they sit every day to silence the mind for an hour or two. Those that are at the bottom of the scale, who have never trained their minds, find it necessary to speak in order to think. It happens even that it is the sound of their voice which enables them to associate ideas. If they do not express them, they do not think. I'm sure we've all met people like that. At a higher level, there are those who still have to move words about in their heads in order to think, even though they do not utter them aloud. And you'll often see the person enunciating, what if I do this? And sometimes with age, they lose the control of their speech and they keep on talking to themselves. Those who truly begin to think are those who are able to think without words. So that's the next level. That is to say, to be in contact with the idea and express it through a wide variety of words and phrases. There are higher degrees, many higher degrees, but those who think without words truly begin to reach intellectual state, and for them it is much easier to make the mind quiet. That is to say, to stop the movement of associating the words that constantly move about like passers-by in a public square, and to contemplate an idea in silence. So here's a simple exercise you can do. You can think about, with words, let's say the idea of the divine's love for you. The divine feels the love to everybody. The divine feels the love for me. The divine loves me irrespective of what I do or don't do, and so on. You can think ideas. Or you can hold this idea of the divine love, the divine's love for the world, for the creation, and hold the idea and stay in it with a silent mind, with a focus on that idea of the divine's love for you. And let your mind become very quiet and let the feel of it gradually fill the idea. So the idea is a form, it's a container for the experience which is behind the idea. And when you catch an idea in its pure sense and hold yourself in a state of silent mind only on idea, bit by bit you cut through the idea to the experience behind. And after a while you begin to feel the divine's love for you and for the whole universe. It's a very interesting exercise, but she's referring to this. To contemplate an idea in silence. I emphasize this fact because there are quite a few people who, when mental silence has been transmitted to them by occult means, are immediately alarmed and afraid of losing their intelligence. This, you will recall the experience when Sri Aurobindo transmitted the mental silence to someone, and he jumped up and said, "Oh, I'm going mad." Because they can no longer think, they fear that they may become stupid. But to cease thinking is a much higher achievement than to be able to spin out thoughts endlessly, and it demands a much greater development. So, from every point of view, and not only from the spiritual point of view, it is always very good to practice silence for a few minutes, at least twice a day. But it must be a true silence, not merely abstention from talking. And then she says, "Now let us try to be completely silent for a few minutes." And she, of course, is trying to transmit. Whoever caught it, that's a different thing. Further on in the same series of talks, now she comes to the thing which I wanted. And here she's speaking about the ability to transmit thought clearly, with great clarity. So here she speaks about how the idea, pure idea, can take on a clear mental form, and when it has a clear mental form, it transmits itself much more easily also. So this is from Mother's 5th of March 1958. And it started because someone asks about reversal of consciousness. She speaks about that, and then you see things from a completely different way from another side. And then she says, words are not good and useful unless through a special grace they put you into contact with the thing, but in themselves they have no value. In fact, the ideal condition, which has always been partially realized by some people, is to transmit the essential idea, and even something that is higher than the idea, the state of consciousness, of knowledge, of perception, directly through the vibration. When you think, and now she's describing this whole experience of the mental world and then this transmission. When you think, the mental substance vibrates in a certain way in accordance with the form your consciousness gives to your thought. And it is this vibration which should be perceived by the other mind if it is well attuned. So somebody is speaking to you about an experience they had. Let's say it is an experience in a state of deep concentration. I was in a state where I was feeling like this. It was as if everything was very quiet and I was as if close to everything, and yet they were different. You don't know what they're talking about because the words seem contradictory. But if you make your mind very quiet and then you try to feel what they're feeling, and then you enter into what is behind the words, and the words act like a torch which goes this, and each view triggers a glimpse of an aspect of the experience. So it is this vibration which you have to perceive, she says. Indeed, words serve only to draw the attention of the other consciousness or the other center of consciousness so that it may be attentive to the vibration and receive it. So because you used a word, the mind goes, ah yes, that angle, and then this angle. It only draws attention. But if it is not attentive and doesn't have the capacity to receive in comparative silence, you may pour out miles of words without making yourself understood in the least. And there comes a time when the brain, which is very active in emanating certain vibrations, can only receive vibrations which are clear and precise. Otherwise, it is a kind of a vague mixture of something confused. So when your mind is now used to that kind of clarity, you can read or hear these people who talk so many words, and it's just a cluster of words. You miss the clarity. When you get used to that, he says, otherwise, it is a kind of a vague mixture of something confused, imprecise, which gives the impression of a cloudy, woolly mass and doesn't evoke an idea. So one speaks, the sound is clearly heard, but it conveys nothing. It is not a question of sound, it is a matter of precision of the vibrations. So when you hear someone who speaks from that clarity of thought, you catch the idea quickly. When the person doesn't have the clarity of thought, you have patches and confused words. So now she goes into something very deep. If you can emanate your thought in a very precise way, If it is something living and conscious, emanating from your consciousness and going to meet the other consciousness, if, so to speak, you know what you want to say, then it arrives with the same precision. It awakens the corresponding vibration, and with the corresponding vibration comes the corresponding thought or idea or state of consciousness, and you understand each other. But if what is emanated is woolly, imprecise, if you do not know very well what you want to say, if you yourself are trying to understand what you want to say, you see how people actually, they are not sure what they want to say and they start speaking to become clear. And if, on the other hand, the attention of the hearer is not alert enough, or he is busy and active somewhere else, well, then you may talk to each other for hours, you will not understand each other at all. This again is the other factor. You are not clear in transmitting, but the other person is not interested or distracted. So while this communication is happening, if the other person's mind is wandering or he's thinking of something else, you miss the transmission. And then she says, and in fact, this is what happens most often. When you're able to see in the consciousness of others the result of what you have tried to communicate, it always gives you the feeling of, you know what distorting mirrors are? Have you never seen distorting mirrors? Mirrors which make you look taller or fatter, which enlarge one part and reduce another part. You're faced with a grotesque caricature of yourself. Well, that is exactly what happens in the other person's consciousness. You have an altogether grotesque caricature of what you have said. And people imagine that they have understood each other because they have heard the sound of words, but they haven't communicated. So this is again an experience you will have. You discuss something in great detail, and then afterwards the person says, "Oh yes, I understood. I agree with you. This is what you have said," and they repeat something totally different, and it doesn't match anything of what you tried to convey. So now she comes to the skill which we can all develop, and we should work towards this. So if you want to exercise the least effect on the mental substance, this is what we need to master action in the mental world. The first thing is to learn how to think clearly. And not a verbal thought which depends on words, but a thought which can dispense with words, which can be understood in itself without words, which corresponds to a fact, the fact of a state of consciousness or a fact of knowledge. Just try to think without words, you will see where you stand. Have you never tried it? Well, then try. So think without words. You get to an idea of what you want to say. Maybe you have words. Now make the words very quiet and hold the pure idea of what you want to say. And stay in it. And let it become more and more clear. And then from there, let it form itself into words. And you will find the words will flow in a state of silence. And as they flow, sometimes you won't know what word you're going to say next. You'll be only be holding the thought. And the word will form itself. And the next word, and the next word. And you'll say, that was the right word. Oh, it's so well articulated. But you are not conscious of the particular form of words, you're conscious of the thought. Not only that, when you hold yourself in that poise of an experience, you will notice a thought emerges and flows into words. And by the time this thought formulates itself, the next thought begins to come up. And even before this has formulated, a third thought is emerging. And all this in the silence of the experience which you hold. And your attention will be on the next thought, even while you're speaking on the first thought. The second thought is forming itself, and the third thought is emerging. And you're watching the sequence, and it's so beautifully put. And so, this is a worthwhile training. If you develop this very quickly, all these abilities and powers of the mind in its pure operation will begin to develop. Because, in fact, right now this is happening within you, even when you speak. Only you are focused more on the realm of thought, word, idea, band, not on the silence above pure idea or the experience of it. You are focused here and oscillating between these layers. Then Mother continues, to a still greater power which is possible for all of us. You have an absolutely clear and precise understanding of what you want to communicate to others. It vibrates in a special way. It has the power to give a form to the mental substance. And then afterwards, as a concession to human habits, you organize a certain number of words around it to try, there, much lower down, to give a verbal form to the vibration of consciousness. But the verbal form is entirely secondary. It is a kind of covering, a rather crude one for the power of thought. And someone asks, what provides the words? Mother. No, think clearly. I don't understand you. It is coming like that, like a whirl of cotton wool, and it makes no sense to me, Mother says to this questioner. And then the person says, I see. The word comes out before the thought is formed. Mother says, exactly. The illustration of this power of thinking is what used to be called the gift of tongues. And in fact, this phenomenon did take place and can still do so. Now, this is something quite amazing when you read about it, but she will describe the rationale behind, and you will see it is so obvious and potentially accessible to all of us. She says, you think, that is to say, what I call thinking. What I call thinking. Quite independently of words, with a clear vision of things and the power to communicate this vision, this phenomenon of consciousness which can be transmitted. Now, you are with a large number of people or with a few people who speak different languages and are used to thinking only in one particular language, for they have been brought up like that. But you project the vibration of your vision, of your understanding, of your experience of things. To attract the attention of the audience, you pronounce some words, any language at all. The one most familiar to you, that's of no importance. But your vision and your emanation are precise enough to be transmitted directly to the brain of the other, to the brain of the others, and in their brain automatically translated into their own language. So outwardly you are speaking in French or in English, but each one understands in his own language. People think this is a legend. It is not a legend, and it is quite understandable. It is something almost elementary when one goes into the region which I call the region of thought. I'm not speaking of supramental things, mind you. It is not a supramental power. It is simply the true realm of thought. That is, you begin to think. And if you had an audience which also thinks, the phenomenon would take place automatically. Only there are very few people who really think. And when they do it powerfully enough, it breaks down the obstacle in the altogether superficial and down to earth perception. It rises up like this gesture showing a curve. It goes up into a higher region of perception, and then in each one, it falls back into the domain of his own language. And each one says with all the sincerity of his experience, oh, this person is speaking this language. And another says, excuse me, he is speaking that one. And the third one says, oh no, he is speaking that other one. And in fact, each one is telling the truth. He probably does not speak any of them except the one he normally uses, or one or two others. But it's that. It does this same gesture and then falls back like radio waves. There, Mother says, there, we are going to try. I'm going to tell you something. We shall see if you understand. And then Mother goes for the meditation in the silence. So maybe if we become very quiet after reading this, we might still catch the vibration of what she conveyed to that group on that day. Because that clear thought she articulated is still there and is still associated with this text. But so we now end with this part of the discussion. There are a few other portions which also relate to the power of thought and clarity of wordless communication. But this last one, which I read out, is in fact what Mother herself did when she said that, oh, it's not just a legend and it's quite common. She's saying that from her own experience. And I've shared here that experience before. It was a group that came from Karnataka, from one of the more outlying villages, who had only the linguistic uh, knowledge of their own Kannada language. And a few people, of course, spoke in English, but that was all. And the group came and met with the mother. Afterwards, the group went to eat in the dining room. And while they were eating, one of the members of the group who only knew Kannada, he said, you know, mother told me such and such a thing. And the other people said, no, it can't be. How can it be? You see, each one of them took blessings, and sometimes they had some conversation. And so the person says, mother told me such and such thing. They said, it can't be. What language did she speak? He said, of course, she spoke in Kannada. And they said, no, but it's impossible. Mother does not know Kannada. How can it be? Oh, but he says, I asked her in Kannada, and she answered in Kannada. So he was adamant, and so because he was so adamant, the head of the group sent word to the mother, and it went through my teacher, MP Pandit, and he took to the mother and asked, this is what they're saying. Mother said yes, and she repeated pretty much what we just read. She says, there is a zone above the word form of the language where the pure idea can be communicated. And if you go on that level, the person can speak any language and you will understand. And you answer in your language and he will understand. Now, this obviously meant to this person who spoke or who heard the mother in Kannada, in his mind, that access had sufficiently developed. If it had not, she could have transmitted, but his receptivity would have been somewhat weak. But even with a weak receptivity, if her transmission is strong, it would take this result. But obviously, something in his mind had that clarity of reception also, so it happened easily. But it is an exercise we can all attempt. The key is to take at first a language which you are only weakly familiar with, and then listen to somebody who is speaking with great clarity or expressing a strong experience. And so you catch a few words of the language enough to give your mind a direction of the meaning, but the rest of it, you make your mind very quiet and try to feel what he is saying or what he is trying to communicate and catch. So, as an exercise, it is extremely valuable, extremely useful, and you'll find you can sense much more than the words which are spoken. Sometimes you will catch insights of thoughts which are not spoken also. And you'll say, this is what the person wanted to say, but he only spoke a little bit of it. And all of this becomes possible when you start training your mind to become silent. So, first step of the training, make your mind silent. And in the silence of your mind, the consciousness is also greatly amplified. And the consciousness of pure mind, pure thought, pure idea can also grow. And you can then train yourself to rise above words to pure idea, hold idea without words, and then articulate with words, and so on. There was a brief discussion last time afterwards as we were driving back about this words and thinking without words. And so I'll read about this. This is from Mother's Agenda, where she's speaking with Supreme, August 27th, 1966. And then Mother points to the stack of bulletin journals. She says, we live in words. It's unfortunate. And she says, one can't think without words, but one can know without words. The phenomena of consciousness that aren't expressed in words are always of a much higher quality, much higher. And Supreme says, but to convey them to others, you have to use words. Mother, yes, that's the trouble. If only I could make them receive my answer without writing words, it would be really precious. You see, she doesn't say, if only I could communicate. She can communicate. She says, if I could make them receive my answer without words, without writing words, it would be really precious. It would save a lot of time. But not 1 in 1,000 receives like that. Some do receive, but very few. Then that's about it. I had also another example, which I thought was a very beautiful articulation of this idea. This was spoken by one of the very recent masters in Europe. His name was Paul Baumann in Switzerland. I had occasion to meet with him twice. He was quite an exceptional man. And it was with him that I mentioned earlier, I had on some occasion, I had this experience that sitting with him, he was drowsy, he was 91, 92, and he seemed to fall asleep. So I said, okay, he's meditating, I'll also meditate. And I connected myself with and invoked Mother's and Sri Aurobindo's presence. And in the moment when I experienced the contact, he brightly opened his eyes and said to me, "Your friends are most welcome here." And I said, well, what is he talking about? Is it my friends like in human friends, or is it this? I didn't expect in Europe to meet someone who would have access to that kind of communication. So I'm actually at two levels at that point. And is he talking about this or that? And then again he closes his eyes. And then he opens again and says, "Are they happy with what they have found upstairs?" Upstairs was his temple room. So it was clear he was speaking of the presence of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo. He caught instantly the fact of their presence and was communicating. And it was a similar thing. This was in my second, I think the second meeting. The first meeting, which was just a little while before, when he was talking about something, it was through a translator. And I was struggling to understand because he was speaking like 3 or 4 sentences, and the translator would reduce it to one short sentence. And I knew I was losing a lot. So as he was speaking, I was trying to tune into what he was saying. And so there was this 2 levels of connection. Here was the indication through the translation, and there I was trying to feel what he was trying to say. And there were very clear things which I could catch. And it was clear what he meant. And what came through the translation was very confused and often a little piece, but it was enough to confirm that what I had caught was real and it was what he meant. And later, sitting with the person who was translating, I asked, "Can you elaborate? What was the point there?" And I confirmed that it was pretty much what it was. But it was possible, and it was an exceptional, he was an exceptional being, and it was one of the most exceptional experiences I will say I've had in my life with people of a spiritual kind. So he said to his people something very interesting. He said, "You know, one word conveys only one little piece of an idea, and one sentence constructs the full idea. We should be able to communicate an entire sentence in a single word, or an entire paragraph in a single word." And he was trying to get them to understand that they have to learn to be able to receive like this. So he should be able to say, "Look," and you should catch the whole experience that he shows you. That's the idea, isn't it? A single word should be able to say. And of course, depending on what you're saying, if I say, "Look," that's not the tonality of the look, but the idea which I convey. And then "look," and it's a different idea. But the sense was, he said, you should be able to condense an entire paragraph into a single word. And then he said, that's how it is in the higher worlds. You think about that. When you enter the mental world, and all that we have read of the Mother's description, it's so obvious. This is what she's saying. And maybe you can dispense with the word. You are communicating, projecting a single idea experience, I will say, or a pure experience just like that. And maybe at best you use a single word to speak, and that's it. It's done. And this is what Mother would do often. When people would ask her a very complex question, and she would give a one-word reply, "Yes." And in the yes, there was the full power of the action to be done and the full scheme and plan of what had to be worked out, and everything transmitted and conveyed, and even the strength given to the person to execute and complete it. That's the kind of communication that is possible from that poise. In another book, I had read of a similar interesting conversation. This is in a book called Rolling Thunder, which was a white American who was with a Native American healer, teacher, master for a while, and he documents his experiences. There he documents how he saw that man speaking to another Native American medicine man, teacher, master, whatever term you use. They were talking. And so at first, he was narrating a conversation or whole interaction he had. At first, he's using words quite loudly. And then bit by bit, his words began to drop in volume. His eyes began to close, and the other fellow's eyes began to close, and they went as if into a kind of a half sleep state. And the words he was speaking became less and softer until this man, listening to it all, felt as if he couldn't hear anything. But at the end of it, when the thing was completed, both of them opened their eyes, and the other fellow began to ask very precise, detailed questions, as if he had heard everything in detail. So it was as if they were connecting in consciousness by training. They had the ability to lean into each other's consciousness, and at that point, the physical volume of the words dropped, and the experience was as if conveyed, but with full clarity of rich detail. And I'm sharing these experiences and examples to show you that it is not something difficult. Mother says she's not speaking of supramental, it's part of the mind training alone. And it is available to all of us if we work upon it. I think that we complete our discussion with the mental domain. And having said all this, Sri Aurobindo has described the mental world. The next paragraph, he moves obviously to the next level. These highest worlds. You remember he said the mind melts into the worlds below, and the highest at the heights of the mind power into the worlds of a more spiritual existence. What are those towards which it drifts up and melts into them? These highest worlds are therefore supramental, transcending the mind. They belong to the principle of supermind, the free, spiritual, or divine intelligence or gnosis, and to the triple spiritual principle of Satchidananda. From them, the lower worlds derive by a sort of fall of the Purusha into certain specific or narrow conditions of the play of the soul with its nature. So, this is going to be the discussion next Friday. The relationship of these higher ranges, which are the free, pure consciousness, liberated, spiritual, and from there how the mind, vital and physical worlds form by a fall of the Purusha. And what does it mean of this fall of the Purusha? What are these narrow conditions of the play of the soul with its nature? How does this form? And more importantly, the fact that there is no gulf between all these worlds. Each melts into the next, below and above. Which means our own mental consciousness not only drifts down, integrating all the way into our physical body, but into the higher ranges, drifts and melts into the higher spiritual ranges. And just as we have seen from each of these planes, there's an influence on the lower, the vital on the physical, the mind on the vital and the physical. So from these supramental realms, the influences on the mind and the vital and the physical, all of which will be part of the discussion of the next paragraph, which is the last paragraph of this chapter, which we take up next Friday. We can close with an Om 5 times together.